Mr. Speaker, the public are extremely concerned about what happened in the Kabatu case. They want to know there won't be a repeat. So I'm putting to him a very clear question about his responsibilities. I repeat, can he reassure the House that since Kabatu was released, no other asylum-seeking offender has been accidentally let out of prison? Can he answer the question?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward to being up against the member for Newark next time. In 25 years in this House, I've not witnessed a more shameful spectacle, frankly, than what the party opposite left in our justice system. Their criminal negligence on his watch as a former Justice Minister. They left our prisons on the brink of collapse entirely, threatening to allow offenders to run wild on our streets. He knows that. Rape victims waiting years for their day in court. He knows that. Neighbourhood policing decimated, leaving our people feeling unsafe in their communities, and they haven't learned a thing. We are tackling knife crime, that's why it's falling. 13,000 more bobbies we are putting on the streets, kicking out 5,000 foreign criminal offenders. I've got to say to the honourable gentleman, he should do better.
David Lammy's response in Parliament was a masterclass in political reframing. When pressed by James Cartlidge on whether any other asylum-seeking offenders had been mistakenly released, Lammy sidestepped the question entirely. Rather than addressing present accountability, he redirected attention to past Conservative administrations, launching a scathing critique of their record in government. Invoking 25 years of parliamentary experience, Lammy painted the justice system as teetering on the edge of collapse, arguing that the real scandal lay in the criminal negligence of his predecessors, not in the current government's handling of the Kabatu case. His rhetoric was deliberately vivid. Rape victims enduring years without justice, policing stretched to breaking point, criminals operating with impunity. By framing the debate this way, he transformed a question of procedural oversight into a moral indictment of Tory governance. Lammy's closing remark, "He should do better," was not a direct answer, it was a strategic pivot. By shifting the burden of credibility back onto Cartlidge, he ended the exchange on his own terms, achieving rhetorical dominance without offering factual resolution. In essence, Lammy didn't answer the question, he neutralised it, turning a potentially vulnerable moment into a calculated political manoeuvre, a technique that, in parliamentary debate, is often the objective.
I wasn't in charge of BBC News, so I wasn't part of those meetings, and I left some time ago. So I think what's happening now really is what's key. What he shows on a whole range of issues, from the misediting of the Trump video during the presidential election campaign or just after it, to the material on Israel and Hamas, and other material that's likely to emerge over the next few days, is a kind of structural bias within the BBC, a liberal bias within the BBC. And you see it across a range of issues where a certain point of view on the world, a certain liberal point of view on the world, was dominating the way the news was reported and was dominating what was not reported, and which meant that certain aspects of the news, like that Trump video, the Panorama, a flagship BBC programme, there was a team there who very, very clearly misrepresented what Donald Trump had to say.
They absolutely understand that, but is it right then to say, oh, that's Tim Davies' fault?
Well, it sounds like you're a fan of him, Eamon. I mean, I think I think what happens when editorial failure is this significant, who is ultimately responsible when it's a sustained series of editorial failures? If you just ignore it and carry on as normal, I think that's very problematic. I accept you feel differently, but from my perspective...
No. What I'm saying is, whether it's you or whether it's Tim Davie, I think there's an easy thing that says, right, there's something that's happened here, the boss man has to go. And my point is, the boss man surely is so busy, does the boss man really understand, or is he across all the details that we are asking him or her to be?
Yeah, so I think that would be a fair argument if it was one issue. So if there was one misedit on a Panorama programme, obviously the Director General would not be across that. But that's not what Mr. Prescott is describing. You know, when you see the report and you see the examples, he's describing a systemic failure, both in its journalism and the management and oversight of that journalism. And that's why it is a senior management issue. It's not about an individual failure. It's about a systemic problem of structural bias in the newsroom and the way that's impacting how the BBC reports.
And Michael Prescott also saying that part of the issue is the way that this is handled by BBC managers, which is exactly what we're talking about now. He said that when executives are confronted with evidence of serious and systemic problems, that's become a systemic problem in itself.
That's right. And that's why it's a problem for senior management and not individual journalists, because he clearly had reached a point of despair. He's a senior, respected journalist, Mr. Prescott, and he didn't write this report clearly. I don't know him, I've never met him, but he didn't write this report because he was worried about one or two failures. He was whistleblowing on a culture of failure and the failure of management to deal with that. And that's why this is really so serious.
So if I've got you right, Danny, you're saying Davy should go?
Yeah, he should. And of course, the head of in another age, the head of BBC News would have already had to resign in embarrassment. I mean, we've seen it before in the BBC. I think there's a failure of governance going on at the BBC at the moment, where things as serious as this, they just put up the walls and say, we're not taking it seriously, even when the evidence is so clear. I'll just give you, if you've got a moment, a couple of interesting anecdotes which say something about this. So on BBC Arabic, which I've written on a number of times and has been the source of reporting of pro-Hamas propaganda. They've used journalists who've celebrated the October 7th attacks. Mr. Prescott reveals that one of those people appeared 500 times on BBC Arabic. He also shows a systemic bias in the way it reported stories around Hamas. When this was raised with senior news executives at the BBC, one of the things they said was, well, we're nearly as popular as Al Jazeera as a defence.
So the defence was they were getting the ratings and therefore they were succeeding.
You know, if the standards the BBC is expecting now to reach are to be as popular as Al Jazeera, we've got a very significant problem. And that was the kind of defence that was being mounted. And I think that's extremely serious and extremely worrying for the future of the BBC.
Well, on that note, do you think the government needs to stop its taxpayer-funded subsidy of BBC Arabic?
I don't doubt that for a second. The failure to reform it is an absolute disgrace. And I tell you, as a Jewish person, knowing that the BBC is funding a service which has pumped out Hamas propaganda, terrorist propaganda, and has given a platform hundreds of times to people who have said things like that the Palestinians should do to the Jews what Hitler did. Those are the kinds of things some of their people have said. That those people have appeared on the service and there's been no real changes is deeply dismaying. And I think what makes that even worse now as a Jewish person is that people at the BBC have described BBC Arabic journalism as exceptional and that there's no problem with it. What we now know is they were aware of this report, the report that Mr. Prescott refers to in his report, which laid out the failing of BBC Arabic. And yet senior management at the BBC have been telling the Jewish community, nothing to see here, exceptional journalism created by BBC Arabic.